Hello there, and welcome to Dialogue brought to you live. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. India, China's biggest neighbor and perhaps in many ways the biggest regional competitor in Asia, starts a honeymoon trip this month with two high-profile visits to Washington. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh addressed the joint meeting of the U.S. Congress on July the 19th in an elaborate welcome ceremony that could only be extended to the closest ally of the U.S. This landmark journey takes place just 2 weeks after the Indian Defense Minister signed a decade-long security accord with the Pentagon. After years of estrangement, the two big democracies suddenly fall in love. But can the glamour and media fanfare cover up differences between the two governments over, for example, the NPT and India's traditional policy of non-alliance? Can the U.S. lawmakers be persuaded to approve President Bush's exceptionalism in exporting nuclear technology? And above all, does the strategic partnership target a third country? Joining us now live here in this panel discussion in the studio are Mr. Chen Ruisheng, former Chinese ambassador to New Delhi, and Mr. Makhdoom Babar, editor-in-chief of Dailymail, which is a newspaper headquartered in Islamabad, Pakistan, and Mr. Russell Lee Moses, a visiting American scholar from the Foreign Affairs University of China. But before we start the interview, let's look at this report.
President Bush met the Indian Prime Minister on Monday, with the two sides agreeing to increase cooperation on civilian nuclear energy, space and high-technology issues.
Today we announced the completion of the next steps in strategic partnership. Completing this partnership will help us further enhance our cooperation in the areas of civil nuclear, civil space, and high-technology commerce.
Following Bush's remarks, Indian Prime Minister Singh said India and the U.S. face common challenges that threaten people's way of life and values that both countries hold dear.
Meeting global challenges require there can be no cause that justifies the killing of innocent and defenseless civilians. There must be an international norm of zero tolerance for terrorism.
Singh last visited the U.S. in September 2004. The two countries signed a 10-year agreement in last June, paving the way for joint weapons production, cooperation on missile defense, and possible lifting of U.S. export controls for sensitive military technologies. Wen Zhenning, CCTV.
Welcome back, gentlemen. Shortly after President Putin and his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Hu Jintao, issued their joint declaration on their new vision about the new international political order in the 21st century, U.S. President George W. Bush invites the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to address the joint meeting of the U.S. Congress. That's something pretty rare, to talk about what can be seen as the construction of a coalition of democracies in the new century. Now, what does this mean? What's happening? What are the major factors that prompt the major powers to suddenly talk so much about reconstructing the world's political order?
I think after September 11, there have been so many changes in the world order, and the leaders of various countries would like to put forward their ideas and their propositions for how in the future the world would develop. So in this case, it is not strange that leaders like President Hu and President Putin and now the US President and the Indian Prime Minister would like to put forward their own ideas. I think it's worth, of course, studying all these ideas.
Mr. Babar, Ambassador Chen seems to suggest that September the 11th terrorist attack should figure prominently in examining the political reconfiguration in the international community. What do you think of his point?
Yeah, it is right that after the 9/11 incident, there was a rapidly changing global scenario. Different countries were having different policies. They were shifting different countries' major policies. But this visit, as you have mentioned, this elaborated welcome reception, I'm failed to understand. I mean, what was so special about it? Because India is a country that has, a lot to do. It's in violation of, UN resolutions. It is reluctant for the NPTs. It is not signatory to NPT. It has some proliferation also. So I mean, it has having a hegemonic design. So only if you say it's in the context of the 9/11 incident, it's the backdrop of 9/11 incident. It's not all that. It is something else. We have to have an eye on it, in-depth study, and the facts speak for themselves here.
And some of our viewers may wonder aloud why we do not have an Indian guest speaker here to join our panel discussion. I have to explain to them that we have tried in vain many times to invite Indian diplomats and, if possible, scholars from Beijing, but nowhere can we find them. But the next question goes to Russell. What do you think should be the major key factors that the major considerations behind the burgeoning relationship between the US and India, the so-called two biggest democracies in the world?
I think, like in so many other cases, it depends upon who you talk to. If we go by what the Prime Minister of India said, it seems to be, at least what he talks about, is shared norms, shared values between both the US and India. This is, I think, a meeting based upon plans that the United States has for the long term. That is, it doesn't talk about India in terms of the anti-terror fight the way it does, for example, with other states. It seems to be talking about India more in terms of possibly countering other powers
such as China?
Asia, possibly, but also trying to find sort of a way in which to explain why they shouldn't be closer. I think it's important to keep this in mind here. The major theme, I think, during the state trip and all, was essentially that India and the U.S. belong together because they share so many of the same things.
In fact, the groundwork started 2.5 months ago when U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice visited New Delhi, and the Indian Defense Minister visited Washington shortly afterwards. Some media coverage in the West say that America is obviously attracted by three major things. One is the booming technology expertise, the commercial markets in India, as well as the strategic importance of India as a counterweight to China militarily and economically. Ambassador Chen, do we have to examine the burgeoning relationship between India and China through this Cold War mindset?
I don't agree with this kind of Cold War mindset. In my view, I just say it is a natural thing that India, as a very important country in this region, should have should develop further their relations with other powers like United States. In this case, I should say it is for China. I think we of course watch quite closely, but we don't feel at all nervous about that because this is a kind of normal thing in my view.
Mr. Babar, do you think Pakistan feels that your boat is being rocked by this courtship between India and the U.S. in terms of having closer economic arrangements as well as military partnership?
Yeah, but I have this thing in mind that if the Americans they really want a military balance in the region, this is not the way. I mean, now the Indians are seeking an anti-defense system, anti-missile system, missile defense shield, and more other, lot of defense purchases, missile technologies and all that. Well, that is just their defense purchases are only aimed at becoming more powerful in the region. This only if you take this anti-defense missile shield, that is not required for Pakistan because missile reaction time between Pakistan and India is only 8 minutes, and moreover, it is the accuracy of this anti-missile shield is 30% so far. So, again, I would say the facts speak for themselves. Who are they aiming to? Why are, as you mentioned, that they are trying to make it counterweight for China? But why China? I mean, China has never shown any aggressive design against any country in the region. It has never supported any aggression. It has never used its land. It has never launched any. It's not even given an indication for any aggression for any country in the region. Whereas India is on record to have invaded Pakistan, to have incurred Nepal, to have supporting the separate forces in Sri Lanka, Tamil Tigers, in Bangladesh even. In the whole region, I mean, they have the hegemonic design and they are on record of it. So if you are providing them with such kind of defense assistance and even the nuclear assistance and all that, I mean, you are yourself disturbing the military balance, even the conventional balance and the non-conventional balance, both.
And Russell, do you think the decade-long security agreement between the Pentagon and New Delhi will seriously pose a threat to the security and military balance in this region?
I actually don't, because I think that what the U.S. has been trying to do is it's been trying to essentially smooth ties over with a country, as I noted earlier, that really has a lot in common with. I think that really what the major surprise that comes out of this in terms of the long-term military situation and such is the not getting India to sign on to the NPT, but loosening civilian technology that allows India to continue to develop its nuclear energy programs. That I think is a very big change, and that sort of shift, I think, makes a lot of people in the area curious as to what exactly the U.S. is up to here. And this change really came out of nowhere. And so I think that, to go back to something that I said earlier, it's about the long term as opposed to the next 5 years or so.
Well, I'm sorry, I do not agree with Mr. Russell, because, the Americans have been saying that this thing is being given to India for the peaceful use of nuclear equipment. And this, you remember where the Indians conducted the first nuclear test in 1974 on that nuclear power plant that was given for peaceful purposes by Canadian government. There, where they conducted other tests by the supercomputers that were given by you. I mean, they say one thing, they do other thing, and as you are saying about
Mr.
nuclear...
Babar, here is one paragraph in the Western report. John Bolton, Bush's nominee to become UN ambassador, argued that such cooperation, the nuclear cooperation between the United States and India, would mean rewarding a country that built a nuclear weapon in secret, using technology it obtained under the guise of civilian power. Both North Korea and Iran are believed to have tried the same route to develop nuclear weapons. What do you think of the relevance?
And that is exactly what I was saying earlier, is that this really is a very large shift in U.S. policy towards India and towards South Asia. That in fact, what we are indeed seeing, I think, is the U.S. is on the one hand arguing that Iran and the DPRK have to abide by the NPT, and on the other hand goes to India and says, you really don't have to join the NPT, but please open yourself for international inspections, please open yourself up for some more transparency. And that's why the only way that I can explain this is that the Bush administration's view, not my view, but their view, seems to be that Pakistan is there to counter terrorism. Mm-hmm. India is there to counter possibly China or some other country. That's what they seem to say. And what comes out of this is that India didn't get everything that it indeed asked for, but it got something very large that really represents, I think, a big change in the U.S. approach to the area. It's unclear why that came about. The only explanation that I can come up with is that they're worried about China and they're worried about the long term.
But Mr. Russell, the thing is this, that on September 30th or 29, 2004, U.S. State Department put 2 Indian nuclear scientists